let's have a look at the law of the concave line. The law of the concave line simply says that any concave line that wants to fold back onto itself whilst maintaining a concave line along the folded edge must be free of tension. That probably sounds very fancy and you're wondering what the hell does that mean? Well, let's have a look. If we have a rectangle with a concave line on top and we fold back this rectangle, what we see is just a straight line along the fold. We don't see any concave line like we had on the edge. If we want to make a concave line from this fold, we have to push this point and this point forwards and keep the center in the same place. When we try to do that, we put tension on the center. And as we try to push these two forwards, well, one thing that happens immediately is that the center splits. This concave edge just splits down the center. However, we now do have something of a concave line. So the question is, how does this split give us a concave line along the folded edge? Well, let's have a look at this same concept in a different way. Imagine we have the same rectangle with the same concave edge. This time we have a grid on top of it. If you notice, we have the same number of squares at the bottom as we have on the top because, well, it's just a rectangle. When we split this rectangle down the middle, what we are doing is we're creating an opening in which we can put even more squares at the top while the number of squares at the bottom remain the same. In other words, we have distorted the grid and therefore made the top edge longer than the bottom edge. This means that basically if we would create more cuts, we can make the top edge even longer while the bottom edge remains the same with the same number of squares. Basically, we are distorting the mesh of the material, the grid on the material. Sometimes we can put snips to release the tension because those snips open up and make the edge longer and therefore release that tension from the edge. But sometimes we can't. So what do we do if we are working with fabric where we can't put snips into the edges to release the tension along that concave edge or concave line? Well, because we are dealing with distortions, there are many ways that we can create distortions. The most straightforward way to deal with this is the following. We would take the same grid, or the same rectangle with the same grid. Instead of snipping it and creating open spaces and fill them with more squares at the top, we just stretch the squares at the top and turn them into rectangles. But we keep the squares at the bottom of this edge the same. This gives us a grid like this. So the squares at the bottom half are just squares, but the squares at the top half have now been stretched into rectangles. Now, because fabric has a grid and a mesh due to the weave, we can apply the same principle to fabric. If we fold this back on itself, it just gives us a straight fold. So in order to create a concave line along the fold, we have to push these two ends forwards and keep the center the same, in the same place, so that the edge of this concave line runs parallel to the fold. At this moment it doesn't. It's wider at the both ends and narrow at the middle. But if we would push the ends forwards and keep the middle in the same place, now this concave edge is running parallel to the fold. So there is still tension, as we can see. What do? We distort the top half of the squares of that grid and stretch them into rectangles, hypothetically. And now since the top squares are longer and have become rectangles relative to the squares underneath there, we can fold this back and run the concave edge parallel to the folded edge and get a concave line along the fold. This is simply the law of the concave line. Any fold or any concave line that wants to fold back onto itself whilst maintaining the concave line along the fold must be free of tension. In the case of this fabric, we release that tension by stretching this edge out. This is a simple law that you have to remember because we're going to have many concave lines in our construction, and if you forget about this law, boy, you will be in trouble. So that's it. The law of the concave line is not something that you're going to find in a tailoring book or anywhere else. It's a term that I've created to make communication easier. Just like language that has a set of words, and with the right use of grammar you can create new sentences, the same goes for the techniques. The techniques are equivalent to the words, and if you know the grammar, if you know how to put those techniques together, you can create new sentences, new garments. Now, the problem that we have is that most of the times techniques are assigned really to a particular style or a part of the garment. But if you want to abstract them out and generalize them and use them on other places or other areas, you have to make that convenient. It's as if we say, apple, eat, and that only apples and eating are connected to each other. But you can do so many things with an apple. You can throw it at someone, you can crush it, you can draw it, you can do whatever you want to do with it. You can write about it. Now, if we would say concave line, sleeve, stretch, you would only be restricted into thinking about it in the sense of a sleeve. And maybe if you're lucky, your brain is going to make the connection, oh, I could use it actually somewhere else as well. But if we put the emphasis on the technique itself, then you're more likely to go there and to generalize it and use it on different parts. So that's why I've created that law.